Well, good morning, everyone. It is 9:30. I think we'll begin. Greeting to those who are joining us on the podcast or on social media. Good to have you with us today. Nice to see the sun this morning. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for a sunny day. We thank you for the rain, but we thank you for the sunny day again, and for an opportunity to gather on this hilltop to continue to study your word, particularly as we come to the close of reading through the New Testament. We ask you to continue to guide our conversations and our study, that we might grow in our faith connection to you. In your name we pray, amen. I was going through my pictures. I was doing some sorting of pictures this week. I've gone through an organizational week. I've been reorganizing my shop at home, and I don't know, it's just one of those moments in time where I'm reorganizing things. Carol always gets sort of a little bit antsy about this kind of a week. But I came across this picture that I took about 6 weeks ago. We were in Athens, God's Restaurant. And we were just right below the Acropolis. And when I was looking at it, I was saying, wow, this is sort of cool. I mean, I didn't know God actually ate here. I mean, this was sort of an interesting thing. And as I was looking at it, after I was looking at it and sorting through things, you can't see the Greek there on the right side very well, but it's theon, which it is the restaurant of the gods. And what I wasn't looking very carefully, because I quite often don't, is that the apostrophe was really important in this one. So it's God's, small g, restaurant. What was actually pretty nice to know is that God must actually support Coca-Cola, because I appreciate that, being a Coke drinker. So. All right, so we are in this challenge of reading the New Testament over the past 3 months. We're coming to the end. Next Sunday is the end. We will have, if you were keeping up, you would have read these 5 books this past week: Philippians, 1 Timothy, Titus, Hebrews, and then 1 Peter. And then we catch the rest of the small letters for next week, and then the book of Revelation. So this will have been the 5 books that one would have been in today, this past week. Hebrews is probably the most challenging. It's a fascinating book. I mean, we'll talk a little bit about it this morning. The other ones are fairly short letters. So let's dive into some of these and see where it takes us. Again, Paul writes from prison. We've always typically believed that Paul has written 4 letters from prison. So Ephesians, Philippians, which we'll talk about in just a minute, Colossians, and Philemon. There are a possibility that a few other letters are written as well. 2 Timothy seems to be written from prison by Paul. He doesn't say it as much, but if you read between the lines, it feels as though Paul is incarcerated someplace. You get the sense when you read Hebrews that the writer to the Hebrews is incarcerated or somehow in chains, if Paul is the writer. But at least there's 4 letters we know for sure, because Paul tells us that: Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon, that are the prison letters. I shared with you last week the chronology of Paul's life. Paul's an interesting guy. He's about the same age as Jesus, it seems. He has a conversion. We don't know exactly how quickly after the ascension of Jesus. But there is this period in red there, and no one really knows the length of that period. Paul sort of going into seclusion, and probably rightly so. I mean, Paul was really known as a guy who was persecuting Christians, and he probably needed to take cover for a while to sort of rebrand. I mean, if that's the need. I would have been a little bit concerned if I was somebody who decided as a Jew to confess Jesus. of seeing Paul in a synagogue. I mean, what would he be there for? Take your name. I mean, he'll turn you in. And so Paul probably needed to go in hiding. The other side of that is also that Paul needed to have an education. I mean, in the theology that he was going to go out and share, because we trust so much of Paul for the theology that we ascribe to as Lutherans. How does he come about that? I mean, it is one thing to say, oh, Jesus, and then to be able to share these deep thoughts that he has in Romans and even in Philippians, being by saved by grace alone. I mean, Paul, how did you come to this moment in time? There had to be this training, this teaching time, the work of the Holy Spirit. We know that Paul goes on 3 missionary journeys. He takes various people with him. Paul always seems to work in a team. He doesn't necessarily be solo. He seems to be a solo operator in terms of theology, but he always seems to have a team of folks with him. He is arrested and then eventually taken to Rome. So the prison letters happen in this general area. It is about 3 decades after the time of Jesus, after his ascension. And it's not clear, as I mentioned last week when we talked a little bit about the book of Acts and what happens to the guy at the end of Acts. If you like happy endings, Paul went to Spain. If you don't, Paul died in Rome. There's just no way of knowing. And that's what's sort of interesting today when we talk about a couple of these letters that he writes, these pastoral letters that seem to be written toward the tail end of the first century. Is Paul on a 4th missionary journey? Did Paul get freed from Rome? And did he end up going to Spain? Did he swing back through Greece on his way to Spain? Maybe. You get a sense of that in Hebrews. And you get a sense of that in Titus. And it's just, you just don't know. So these are the 3 maps that I shared with you last week, the 3 journeys that Paul goes on. His first missionary journey is not particularly long. I think he's sort of testing the waters in some respects, but Acts 13 and 14, he goes to eastern Asia. Asia here is Turkey, so he goes to eastern Turkey. His second missionary journey will take him over to Greece, to Macedonia. That was the name at that time. And we'll be at Philippi today when we start with our journey. And then the third missionary journey, he seems to retrace a lot of what he did in the second missionary journey. And instead of simply just making a circle, Paul backs up and he backtracks. He goes back through the places that he had visited. And when you put Paul's journeys all on one map, this is how his travels are. I mean, this guy's a frequent flyer. He gets around. And I can understand why, when you look at that kind of a map and you see all the lines everywhere, that Paul had come to the decision, I'm done here. I mean, how many times do I need to come through? Paul starts stuff. He puts other people in charge of it. And then his idea is that I'm a starter. I'm a person who's going out and planting. I'm not the person who's there generally just watering. So he isn't a maintenance pastor. He is an evangelist. And so his idea of going to Spain makes a lot of sense. I'm not going to take the travel through these areas again. So we are in Philippi, and you can see where Turkey and Greece and Italy are located at. Paul's 4th journey, of course, takes him from Jerusalem over to Crete and then up to Rome, where, again, he stands trial. At least the indication is that he was on trial in Rome in the book of Acts. What happens to him, we don't know. I've mentioned this maybe a couple years ago in one of the Bible classes. If you haven't ever watched this, it's worth watching. David Suset, if you're an Agatha Christie fan, this is the guy who plays Poirot. That's where you'd see the face before. But he did a 2-part series for the BBC on Footsteps of Paul. And he does it in a very intimate way. I mean, it's a different look. It isn't simply just a historical look at Paul, but it's more of an in-depth look of what some of the cultural things that Paul might have experienced. It's free on YouTube. Actually, both of the parts are on YouTube. If you've got Prime, Amazon Prime, you got to rent it. but you can find it free on YouTube. But it's In the Footsteps of St. Paul is what it's called. It's a two-parter. It's a couple hours, and it's really worth watching. I think that he does a really good job of, when I see him as Perot, because I like him as Perot, I don't necessarily view him as a Christian. And it's interesting every once in a while when actors or somebody will come out and become more public about their faith. It's clear that he's inquiring into this, is that he actually is a believer, which is sort of interesting. So Philippians, it is the prison letter, one of the prison letters. It's the fourth prison letter. Philippi is located up in northeastern Greece. At the time, this would have been called Macedonia. Athens is down here. So when Paul was traveling through Turkey, through Asia Minor, while he was on his second missionary journey, he got a vision that God is taking me over the Aegean Sea to Europe. This is a jump of continents. One of the reasons that Philippi is probably a really important church for Paul is because it was on a main highway. And you can see here, this dashed line runs from what would be today Istanbul or Byzantium back in ancient times over to Nicopolis. And you may or may not remember this as you read, but in the book to Titus, he's asking Titus to come and visit him. That's an insignificant fact that you probably don't remember from reading Titus. But he's asking him to come over to a town that's located right here in the book of Titus. Come and visit me because I'm spending the winter here. And this road is known as the Egnatian Way. It was a paved highway. Actually, some of it is still around today. But he would have journeyed from Turkey over to Nicopolis. There's Nicopolis. They're two different towns. And Philippi was where he landed in the end. But the Egnatian Way actually still exists today. I mean, a lot of the road still is there from Roman times. And in fact, there's even some of the bridges that the Romans built that you can still walk over today. I mean, it's really rather amazing in terms of Roman construction. But in Philippians, Philippi was an important city on this east-west road in Greece. It was a wealthy community, largely because there were gold mines close by. So they had money. And one of the interesting things about the book of Philippians is that Paul is writing to these guys to thank them for the money. They sent him some money while he was in prison. Because remember, in the book of Acts, Paul has to rent his place where he is essentially incarcerated. And apparently the news gets out. I'm always fascinated when you read, because over time as you read the New Testament over and over, and even the Old Testament over and over again, you see more of the details in it. And it's interesting in the New Testament, in Paul's writings, of how he must we always view him as writing things to people. He's getting responses back from people. There's letters going back and forth. He sort of knows what's going on. They know what's going on. And so the Philippians apparently know that Paul's in jail. He's in prison in Rome. They send him some money in the second chapter there. What was important about Philippi was that it was a retirement community for military veterans. So this is a military town. There were no synagogues in this town that have ever been uncovered. This is a Gentile community. Paul stops here. And what made this community even famous was, you may or may not remember the names, but Mark Antony and Octavian. Octavian will become Caesar. He becomes the Caesar Augustus that we know of in the New Testament, who plays a role in Jesus' life. Remember, Julius Caesar was assassinated. Brutus and Cassius were the ones that were responsible. These two guys, Mark Antony and Octavian, tracked them down all the way to Philippi because they had armies of their own, defeated them there. And so Philippi became a retirement community for military. And the Roman government rewarded Philippi as a town that they didn't have to pay taxes. So not only having the gold mine close by, but this was actually a fairly wealthy community. So if anybody was going to support Paul, this would have been the community that would have. And when he received the offering or the money, he sends a letter back of thanksgiving to them. Paul visits Philippi at least 3 times. He visits the Philippi the first time through his second missionary journey. The third missionary journey, he visits at least twice. He goes there, going through, and then coming back. Again, there doesn't seem to be any synagogue in Philippi. This is predominantly a Gentile community. And as a result, he probably is writing to Gentiles, which makes somewhat significant. The first, or we've heard before, the first convert there is Lydia. She's the woman who was dyeing purple. I mean, she was making purple linen, which meant that was a very wealthy. I mean, purple was hard to get, but she would be making linen probably for royalty, for the people who had money, the wealthy people. So Philippi had money. What happens there in Acts 16, as you're reading through the Philippians, Paul likely was remembering his sort of introduction in Philippi, was that this is where Paul casts out this demon from this slave girl. And the slave girl was making this guy some money because she, apparently, just the way that she was, he casts out the demon from this slave girl. Paul is arrested, partly because Paul had interfered with the economics of the moment, because this guy was making money off of this slave girl who was demon-possessed, because apparently he could, make her do things because of this demon possession. He casts out the demon because he thought he was helping the girl. So he gets arrested. He gets thrown into jail in Philippi. This is where that earthquake takes place. And the jail doors bust open. And Paul and Silas, they don't escape. But when the jailer comes, who would have been very worried about what had taken place, because the jailer would have been responsible for his prisoners. If he lost the prisoners, he would suffer the consequences of who he lost. And so he comes, and here they're singing hymns. And this guy takes note, apparently. He comes to faith, and the jailer and his family come to faith. This is the letter of joy. This is one of those letters, one of those few letters that Paul writes that really it's very uplifting. He doesn't seem to write about any problems or anything. He's writing because thank you for the gift, thank you for the money, but more so of just encouraging them in their faith to remain faithful. Epaphroditus is the guy who delivers the gift. This guy gets very sick in taking that money to Rome to Paul. Apparently, in Philippians 2, the congregation back in Philippi heard about it and were concerned. So in the letter to the Philippians, Paul actually is saying, he's sharing the news. Epaphroditus is recovered. And in fact, I'm going to send the letter back with him. Paul sends thanks and advice. The co-author of this letter is the guy Timothy, which we'll talk about in just a little while with 1 Timothy. And in Philippians 2, Paul mentions that he's going to send Timothy to them as well. Timothy, when we get to Timothy, Timothy is sort of he's Paul's personal assistant. Timothy ends up going to places that Paul really, I don't think, wanted to go back to. That's not in a negative light, but it's. I think he trusts Timothy. But the reality is that there's a problem in Corinth. Go back and fix it for me. And that seems to be a lot of what Timothy tends to do for Paul. So the outline of the book is pretty straightforward. The main theme is that, and the most famous Bible verse that comes out of Philippians is, rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. I mean, it's a letter of joy. If you want to have an uplifting letter, Philippians is the one to read. He talks about the incarnation of Jesus, which is an interesting theme that Paul would talk about to these guys, the fact that Jesus, God's Son, becomes a human being, becomes one of us. For Gentiles, and particularly probably for maybe individuals more of a Greek orientation, that was somewhat of a stumbling block. This idea that why would God become a human, a being like one of us? Because on the Greek side, gods were up there. They would never come down and mess around, associate with us. So this incarnation of Jesus, that Jesus becomes a human being, really is quite important. He lifts up his associates, Timothy and Epaphroditus. He mentions them in this letter, largely to use them as examples of service. And I think he's trying to encourage the Philippians, to thank you for the gift, continue to live out that faith, continue to be servants of the Lord, find ways of being able to demonstrate your love, not just for sending a gift to me, thank you for that, but show your faith around to others. And then this pressing on with the goal, stay faithful. There was, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, there's a group of folks in Paul's time. As Christianity starts to spread through Judaism in particular, there is a group of radical Jews that start following Paul around. And we tend to call them Judaizers. And where Paul would go, Paul gets into so many problems with this group because they seem to be following him. So where Paul goes and he plants a church, in short order, this group of radicals come to town, Jewish radicals, and try to get those folks pulled back to Judaism. You've made a mistake. Christianity's wrong. Jesus, he's not the Messiah. So the Judaizers come in, and Judaizers were always into this. You've got to remain faithful to Jewish practices and rituals. Because what were Christians doing? Christians were coming in with this idea that Jesus is the Messiah. And actually, all those rules and things don't really apply anymore. That had to be really, really contentious with conservative Jews. And so Judaizers started to follow Paul. And in the reading of the book of Acts, when you read through Paul's, particularly his second journey, and that's not so much prevalent in the third journey, but at least in the second journey, you've got people who are following Paul behind him, maybe by a couple of months, who come to town after Paul's been there, or even when Paul is there. They beat him up in Thessalonica. There's issues that are happening when the Judaizers arrive. And they're going to make things right again. And you Jews, you need to come back to be faithful. So Judaizers were part of this, and I think that's part of what Philippians is encouraging the Christians there, is don't listen to these people. Stay united. And so you've got this letter of joy, and that's basically, Philippians is a pretty simple, straightforward letter. In an excavation in Philippi, there's a jail they have found because it had markings of a jail. Like a lot of things in the Middle East, you don't know. The sign that's by it is the jail that Paul stayed in. Okay, well, is that we don't really know. It's a cave, and it seems to have been venerated for many centuries. Was it the one? But you go sort of get maybe a feel for what things are like. Earthquakes were very common in the Middle East, so having an earthquake quite timely when Paul is in jail helps. It's sort of an interesting one. 1 Timothy. You'll read 2 Timothy this week. 1 Timothy is part of what is known as Paul's pastoral letters. He writes 1 and 2 Timothy to this young man, Timothy, and then he writes to Titus. Timothy, we know some stuff about Timothy. Timothy was originally from Lystra, and that's located in central Turkey. Paul visited Lystra on the first missionary journey, that short one that he went on in the very beginning. We know from 2 Timothy actually some of Timothy's genealogy or his genetics here. His mother whose name is Eunice in 2 Timothy 1, is a Jew who has become a Christian. So Christianity was actually in Lystra, apparently, before Paul arrived. We know that his grandmother, Lois, was also a believer. What's interesting about Timothy's background is that his dad, his father, is a Gentile, apparently a non-believer. This is a mixed marriage that Timothy comes out of, a mixed home, where two of the individuals would have viewed Jesus as Messiah. And the father, who may or may not have had any religious background, formal religious background, other than what Greeks generally would with the mixture of gods, is that he would have been the father. And Timothy comes to faith. So Timothy is already a Christian in Acts 16 when Paul arrives into town. What Paul decides is that this is a good guy. There's a lot of potential in this guy. What's interesting about Timothy is that he's not circumcised. And what does Paul do is that poor Timothy, he circumcised Timothy, but it shows the kind of pressure that Paul is under to try to interface with Orthodox conservative Jews. Circumcision was so important in Judaism. And there were public toilets. I mean, the reality is that, how would people know that a person is circumcised? They're not running around naked. Well, as far as I know, they weren't. Who knows? Who knows? They would have at Roman games and stuff, but generally Jews wouldn't have been participating in those things anyway. But at public toilets, the toilets were public. And so in some respect, you probably could find this information out. But whatever the case is, Timothy, who Paul asks to travel with him, come with me on this journey, and he does, he is not circumcised. Paul decides to circumcise him. This is just the opposite that will happen with Titus. Because Titus, who is a Gentile, is brought to faith. And Titus, Paul decides not to circumcise because of the Jews. You see that, the growth of Paul over time, of what he was probably going through. So this is a little bit of what in Acts 16, sort of a bit of the story about Timothy.
So I have a question. So I felt like Jewish heritage came down through the mother. So it's interesting that he wouldn't have been circumcised if his mother and grandmother were Jews and his father wasn't.
Oh, yeah, good point. The comment was about of how even in a mixed marriage, having one of the partners Jew, why wouldn't the boy have been circumcised? And Jewish people, it was through the father. It was the men in Judaism. In Egypt, it's through women. It's a matriarchal society in Egypt. In Judaism, it's through the man. But what actually would have raised a question is if Lois and Eunice were good, faithful Jews, which may indicate that they weren't as faithful as they probably should have been, is that why wouldn't they had to have their kid, their son, circumcised? And it's a great question. Why not? And it may indicate that that mixed marriage, while the man and the woman were married together, is that religion wasn't playing much of a role in their life. And it may be one of the reasons that Lois and Eunice came to embrace Jesus as Messiah, maybe early, because they may not have had a deeper foundation into Judaism as one would have expected. Orthodox Jews would have definitely had that kid circumcised. Circumcision was the important mark, because it was this whole Abraham thing. Are you connected to Abraham? You bet I am. I've got the mark to show it. Yeah. It's a great question, because that had crossed my mind too, reading this again. It was that, Lois, Eunice, where were you at? Why wasn't your kids circumcised? And it probably was that they weren't maybe regular Saturday synagogue attenders. I don't know. All right. So, travels with Paul. So he joins Paul for journeys 2 and 3. He sticks with Paul. Timothy becomes really one of the right-hand men for Paul. He's often sent to difficult situations. Paul was beaten up in Berea on his second missionary journey that he was going through this town in northern or in the center of Greece. He sends Timothy back to fix it. To Thessalonica, he sent to Corinth a number of times. Corinth had a lot of problems, as you know. And he eventually is asked to stay in Ephesus. Ephesus becomes one of Timothy's big stop-off points. And interestingly enough, Timothy is the one who helps co-author a number of Paul's letters. So Timothy really became sort of one of Paul's right-hand men, a very close companion to Paul. Timothy becomes, what's interesting about the Timothy letters, because it starts raising the question of when this stuff is written. First Timothy is likely that Paul was with Timothy and then, dropped him off, left, and then wrote to him. There's another possibility in 2 Timothy that Paul is in prison. That's why this could be another prison letter. We don't really know. But Timothy becomes, we sort of label him as a pastor now. Or is he an evangelist? What's interesting about Timothy, 1 Timothy, is there's so much here about church management in Timothy. There's 4 themes that run through this book. It's church management, the rise of false teachings. I want to talk a little bit about Gnosticism here. There's the controversial section on women in ministry. And then there is the whole issue about suffering. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, these are powerful letters. What it raises is this question, when does the Christian community start organizing itself? You know, today we got a president of a synod, we got synods, we got district presidents, we got clergy, we've got circuit counselors, we got structure now, don't we? When does that all happen? That's not just an American phenomenon of this organization within the church. When does organization start sweeping over Christianity? We have a Christian congregation who's sort of doing what they want. All of a sudden, who's over us? Who's going to hold us accountable for not teaching the right way? When you think first, second century, even up through the 3rd century, there's not a lot of theological books that are coming out and saying, well, this is what we believe. So if you came into a community and you worshiped with the Christians, what are you going to be how are you going to be worshiping? Could have been anything, probably. But we believe in Jesus. So this church management thing in 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy is really sort of interesting, because Paul here is talking about qualifications for being sort of the head guy in these organizations. They've come to a point where there is a head, there's a leader. While the word pastor isn't generally used in the New Testament, deacon, overseer, that tends to be sort of what we equate this all to. But there is in 1 Timothy 3, and I'm not going to read this. It's clear there are qualifications for being in these roles. You're going to marry to one wife. You're going to have your household in order. You're going to be able to conduct business well. You're going to not be violent. You're not going to be a drunkard. That's helpful, okay? Part of it was what you're doing with your lifestyle is visible to the community in which you live. If you're not living the part, you really give Christianity a black eye. That's what this sort of comes down to. And it's advice for all Christians. That if you don't live your faith visibly, if you're living in contradiction, this is definitely not a good thing for moving Christianity and growing it. This is about a bishop. There is a section right after that is about the deacon. We tend to connect deacons with pastors or overseers. And again, this is, you're not a slanderer, you're sober-minded, you're faithful in all things. Likewise, you must be the husband of one wife. Okay, we sort of get that, because polygamy was part of life. Who sets down these rules? mean, Paul is taking a big step forward in organization. There actually is organization that's starting to spread out over Christianity. How quickly does that happen? Now, we may be talking about 2-3 decades later, after the time of Jesus. Is a decade enough to start raising the question, we need some organization in this group? Who's making the rules? When the Jews come through, the Judaizers come through, and they start challenging us. Well, if you're accepting Jesus as Messiah, you still got to be faithful to the rules and the rituals of Judaism. Who makes that decision? This letter, 1 Timothy in particular, raises this whole letter of how quickly organization comes in to Christianity. And one of the reasons that I would even raise that is the fact that there are some scholars in theological scholars that argue that actually this letter is written later in time, that you're getting into second century stuff, that it takes some time for the church to organize itself in this kind of a fashion, that actually what you have is people who bought into Paul's theology and they write these pseudo letters. For the most part, mainstream scholars believe this is written by Paul, but there is that idea. There's also false teaching that seems to be running around in the first century, and particularly into the second century. Paul emphasizes this need of staying faithful to the teachings, which again, how do you know what the teachings are? But 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus talk about remaining faithful to sound doctrine, sound teachings. Moral conduct becomes very important. Again, living the part of a Christian. That if you're going to live a contradiction, that's not good. It's not good advertisement. In the second century in particular, there is a teaching that started to filter into Christianity. And I think it actually probably went into Greeks. It came out of Greek civilization, but I have a feeling that it also impacted Judaism as well. We know it as Gnosticism. It's what's known as the Gnostic error, Gnosticism. It's a Greek word, and it simply translates knowledge. And this false teaching was this idea, you have to have special knowledge to be part of the group. And we got the special knowledge. It's very mystical, very mystical. This is not Christianity stuff. This is very mystical. And the reason that Gnosticism maybe seemed to be on the rise here is in 1 Timothy 6. O Timothy, guard the deposit entrusted to you. The deposit, of course, being the message that I've shared with you. Avoid the irrelevant babble and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge, Gnosticism. Seems to be that we are already seeing the beginning of that. By professing it with some have swerved from the faith. They've moved away from the faith. Again, for some folks that are critical about when some of this stuff is written, Gnosticism was really an error that came into the second century, but was it already starting to be prevalent? Did Paul notice that in the first century, tail end of the first century? So what Gnostics believed is that the physical world was bad. There's no way God could have created this world in which we live because just look at it. It's a mess. God wouldn't create the mess. So it must have been some lesser God. And this is very much in Greek mentality. There are a variety of gods. So some other God went out there and created the world in which we lived. And so there was a shunning of the world because it was bad. To me, this was sort of the beginnings of monasticism. Because what this actually led to, if you followed this idea that the world essentially is bad, that some other God made it, is that what you would want to give up are all those things that you associate with the world that is not good. Sexuality, the carnal side of life. Money, wealth. It's better to live in poverty, not to have anything. Because if you're going to involve yourself in sort of the trade of things in society, you're just participating in the commerce of this evil, bad world in which we live. And so the simple life, as simple as possible, It's sort of like monks. I mean, when they isolated themselves in monasteries. And so you had to have this special knowledge. That's what Gnosticism was. And so this became a real problem in Christianity, particularly in the 2nd century. A lot of writings on this. Certainly one of the most controversial parts of Timothy is where what the role women play in the life of Christianity. You could argue that Paul was a sexist. I've heard all the arguments over the course of ministry. I mean, we're not going to solve this one right now. But the reality is that Paul very much makes the statement in 1 Timothy 2 that women should not be permitted to teach or have authority over men. That's always been controversial in modern times. I mean, different denominations read this different ways. For some people, they blow this off as sort of, this is cultural, this is Paul's time. Is that he would have been faithful to where Judaism was at, where the role that women played in society. And in some respects, even in some of the other cultures. We know that women are very prominent in Jesus' ministry. Clearly, they played roles. But it's interesting, again, that this becomes part of Paul's discussion with Timothy in 1 Timothy. And then this theme of suffering and shame is that, don't be surprised if you are persecuted or if you suffer. Because isn't the feeling is, I don't want to suffer? God, if you really love me, you'd keep me away from suffering and bad stuff? And Paul's understanding of all of this is that sometimes suffering can serve a purpose. If you're going to stand up for Jesus, it's likely you're going to be persecuted just like he would. If you're going to be faithful to the lifestyle that is purported in Christianity, you're going to take consequences for that. And so this does come up in some of Paul's later letters, where, all who want to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Paul suffered persecution. Persecution was quite common with Christians. And Paul is saying to Timothy, it's likely you're going to be persecuted as well. But it may serve a positive purpose in the end. So 2 Timothy, our 1 Timothy is sort of an interesting letter. We'll look at 2 Timothy next week. Titus, an interesting little short letter. We know very little about Titus. I have no clue really about a lot of Titus's background. Titus isn't mentioned in the book of Acts, which tends to be the history of the early Christian church in the first century. But Paul mentions Titus at least 13 times in his writings. So clearly Titus was a companion of Paul, just like Timothy was. He seems to be a Gentile. We don't know whether or not he was brought to faith by Paul. Could be. He is sent to Corinth 3 times. Corinth had a lot of issues. They needed Timothy. They needed Titus. Who else Paul might have sent to Corinth as he heard about what was happening there. It's possible that he is Paul's secretary. Paul seems to use him as an example. And one of the things that you get from Galatians 2, which you would have not remembered at all, would be that Titus was not circumcised, which tends to indicate this was a Gentile who came to faith. And Paul opted in this particular case, for Timothy, he opted the other way. But for Titus, he said, no, it's okay not to be circumcised. Because Titus, I think, Paul had grown to this point of understanding, you don't have to become a Jew to be a believer. Gentiles could come to faith. You don't have to take on the Jewish rituals. So in Titus, Paul leaves Titus in charge of the church in Crete, an island in the southern Peloponnese region below the fingers of Greece. There's no record that Paul visited Crete during the 3 missionary journeys. But what is interesting is that he seems to be with Titus in Crete as part of this letter. And it's just sort of odd. Titus 3, verse 12 is this interesting, he's writing to Titus, who's in Crete on this island, and he's saying, I'm staying in Nicopolis. Can you come and visit me? I'm going to spend the winter there. And there's really no understanding where we put that then if you look at just the 3 journeys of Jesus. Because it's not mentioned in Acts that he did a missionary trip through the islands. We know that he stopped there on his way to Rome on trial, but they didn't let him off the ship to go and do a bunch of evangelism. So we don't really know. There's no firm idea when or where this letter is written. What's interesting about Titus is that he was traditionally in Crete. We were there about 6 weeks ago. We didn't see his head, but his head is on display in one of the churches on the island of Crete. Crete is a beautiful island. We know that in Acts 27, Paul stops here on his way on his 4th missionary journey, or on the missionary journey that took him to Rome to stand trial. But there is no indication of if he planted Christianity here. This is the church. Titus supposedly died on Crete, and he was buried. This is a Byzantine church, so it isn't one of the originals. But he would have been sort of the bishop or the head of the church here in Crete. When he died, they buried him. Eventually what happens to saints is that when the flesh is all gone, they wrap bones of people, and essentially they give away the relics, the skeleton parts. Titus's head ended up in Venice for a while. I mean, that's where I saw his head. And then they bring it back to Crete, so now it's on display in one of the churches there. Poor saints. I mean, the saints are traveling all over the world in pieces. What's interesting about Titus, and you may remember this one when you read Titus, is that at the very beginning, Paul is not very kind about describing this group of people. I mean, what he says in Titus 1, verse 12, Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, and lazy gluttons. Here, Titus, this is your people. Have at it. Yeah, well. And this is, I mean, are you going to read this letter to the Christians there? Boy, you guys are liars and evil gluttons. Oh, wow. So this is where Paul is at. He's at Nicopolis. And Titus is on Crete. Ephesus is up here. So Crete is down here. Rhodes is over here. Does Paul get out of prison, swing back through Greece, through the islands, leave Titus here on Crete to start the Christian community or to have the Christian community go? Because maybe Paul remembers the island when he was being taken to Rome on the prison ship. And then he heads back and he's going to Spain. But before I go there, would you come up and visit me during the winter? Don't know. So Titus is about Christian lifestyle. I mean, he's talking here about the elders, overseers, that seems to be associated with what are clergy. Same advice, he's talking about good character for the leaders of a Christian community, but also he's saying that everybody has that responsibility. This isn't just defined for the leadership. Everybody needs to live the faith. And then there is some warning against false teachers in the book of Titus. Quickly on 1 Peter, we know, of course, some things about Peter. Peter is Simon, that is his Greek name. Jesus will eventually give him the name Cephas or Peter, which means the rock. He's a fisherman by trade. His brother is Andrew. They own a fishing business. Peter, and his brother wasn't part of this, but Peter was part of what was known as the inner circle, Peter, James, and John. Those three were with Jesus in a variety of special events. Transfiguration, where were the disciples? All of them were down at the bottom of the hill, except Peter, James, and John. They were there. They seem to be in these really important moments in time. It's likely that Peter was married. Otherwise, why would Jesus be healing Peter's mother-in-law? He does in Matthew 8. Did Peter have children? Some believe that he did. Pentecost, he seems to become the leader of the church. He becomes at least spokesman for the group. And he does seem to always be one who is putting himself out there in front. First Peter is likely written from Rome. Again, this could be a prison letter. We don't know for sure. Or was Paul simply in Rome sending it back to Peter? We know that in 1 Peter 5, verse 13, he talks about being in Babylon. And that Babylon is not in Iraq. It seems to be Rome. The city of Rome tended to be viewed as Babylon. Terrible Babylon. It was, all the things that you would look down at is Rome. This is a general letter. And 1 Peter 1, verse 1, it is written to a wide range of area. It's not necessarily written to communities. It's not written to any community. It's written to a region. This is meant to be a circular letter, which is sort of interesting. And it's written to those who have been dispersed. They're not concentrated in Jerusalem anymore. The dispersion was, through persecution and stuff, Christians moved out and they spread out, just as the Jews did. There is a dispersion of the Jews as well. And so Silas seems to be the secretary. We know that Peter is killed in 64, 68, around the time that St. Paul likely was executed. And so the region that is part of this letter is pretty much all of Turkey, except for just the very southern rim of it. This is simply just a circular letter. Send it around, read it, digest it. Tradition is that Peter is buried here in St. Peter's Basilica, underneath the high altar in Vatican City. That's the high altar at the end of that picture. And this isn't two pictures, this is one. When you get up to the high altar in St. Peter's Basilica, it's actually a split floor. And the top part there's a high altar there. And when you see Easter service, things like that are in St. Peter's Basilica, that's where they go. They got to walk around the stairs that go down underneath it. And what's underneath it is the crypt. There's a lot of people buried down there. They've done research and they've done carbon testing on the bones that they found underneath the high altar. They date back to the 1st century. And the Catholic Church believes that is where Peter is buried. So. And I don't know if actually you can get down there anymore. Years ago when I was in Rome, we were able to get down there. It was interesting. 1 Peter is about suffering for Christ. It's the sufferings, persecution. Suffer for Jesus. That should be no surprise. Jesus suffered. So why wouldn't we suffer? 1 Peter talks about Christians are this new Israel, this new group that has arisen. One of the famous Bible verses that come out of 1 Peter is, we are the chosen people, the royal priesthood. We are the new Jerusalem. Baptism and spiritual growth, that's all part of this. You're like newborn babies. Use the milk, but grow as newborn babies, grow in your faith. There's a whole section here, again, if you haven't read it, this section in 1 Peter talks about submission to authorities that are non-Christian. And so it touches upon the government, Roman government, masters who are not believers, husbands who may not be believers. It's an interesting letter. A variety of things here that Paul is talking about to Peter. And then this is the last one in Hebrews. This one, the book of Hebrews, when you read the book of Hebrews, it's different from Paul's writings. There's always been controversy as to whether or not Paul wrote this, because the writing style is just not Paul. Generally, Paul always has this long, lavish introduction. This one doesn't. The writing in Greek is very good. In fact, this is one of the best written Greek documents in the New Testament. And so there's a lot of scholars who say, well, Paul couldn't have written that. Well, maybe Paul dictated it, and whoever was the secretary writing it down wrote it, don't know. But it's all about understanding Old Testament, of how the Jews got from Israel over to Egypt and how they got back. You got to understand that, partly to understand the book of Hebrews. You got to understand Old Testament Jewish rituals. Because all of it is about when you get into the Sinai desert after you get out of Egypt, they build the tabernacle church. It's sort of God in a box being carried around. It's that Ark of the Covenant that Indiana Jones found. It's Exodus 25 through 26. It is this tent church that becomes important. What was the point of it all? Well, God was there, but what did you do for him? You sacrificed. I mean, the tabernacle was all about sacrificing. Actually, the temple was all about sacrificing. It was about the Old Testament sacrificial system. That is the framework of the book of Hebrews. And it gives you this idea of why Jesus had to suffer and die. He is ultimately the sacrifice. Just as we sacrificed in the Old Testament, that these animals died in our place. They took on our sin. We transferred sin to them. Jesus did that. What's interesting about the book of Hebrews is that Jesus is not just the sacrifice, but he's the priest as well. And this is where you have to really understand Old Testament customs. The role of the priest, the role of the sacrifice. Jesus is the priest and the sacrifice. This has always been a controversial book. There's some folks who don't believe it should have been in the New Testament, others who embrace it. I mean, it's everybody in between. We know that Origen, one of the church theologians in the 3rd century, in the 200s, when asked about who wrote Hebrews, he said, only God knows. We don't know. There was a decision made when the King James Bible was translated. They decided to put at the head end of that translation, this is the epistle of Paul the apostle to the Hebrews. And as a result, most people now buy into the fact that Paul wrote this letter. But there really isn't a lot of evidence that he did. And not that it really makes a lot of difference. I mean, if this is God talking to us, it probably in some respects doesn't matter who is writing it in the end. If you want to date this kind of book, what's interesting about Hebrews is that it talks so much about sacrificing and sort of the Old Testament customs. The temple was destroyed in Jerusalem in the year 70. The end of sacrificial system, that ended sacrificial system. That was a traumatic event in the Middle East. Why wouldn't have that been mentioned? Because it's not mentioned in really any of the New Testament writings. Is it irrelevant to Christians then that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed and now the Jews are dispersed? They have to leave Jerusalem. Don't know. We do know that Timothy is still alive in this book in chapter 13. It seems as though he's in prison now. And in chapter 13 also, whoever is writing this, if it even is Paul, is that he's planning a visit to wherever this is located at. The Hebrews, it's a general letter in some respects. It's written to Jews who have become Christians. There's possible locations of where it was written. The contents of the book, there's no greeting in this book. It's just a bit of odd for Paul. Long exposition on Jesus being the true priest. And this true priest gives up his life for the people. That's what this is really significant. Melchizedek, well, we could talk more about that. I mean, it's connecting into the Old Testament. You almost have to know some Old Testament to be able to know what this book really is getting down to. There's so much symbolism. But some of the themes that run through it, again, this Christianity versus Judaism. Is it good to be a Jew to come to Christ? Is it better to be a Gentile and come to Jesus? It doesn't matter. Do you have to, if you were a Gentile who came to faith in Jesus, do you have to take on Jewish customs? No. That does seem to be resolved by the time you get to Hebrews. It's not about Jewish rituals. There's a long conversation on Christology. I mean, Jesus being superior. He is today, tomorrow, forever. We don't need anything else. What Hebrews does talk about are the two natures of Christ. True God, true man. That is significant. True God and true man. He is the ultimate high priest, so he's both the priest and the sacrifice, and we're on this journey. We're on this journey, and this journey is going to take us through suffering, and that's okay. And one of the things that sort of is promised in the writing is that those who persecute will be punished. So you don't have to worry about getting revenge now. The day of judgment, God will take care of it. Yeah, we got a lot of this stuff. We're out of time here. It's interesting. There's some examples that the writer to the Hebrews uses as people of faith. When you talk about Abraham in the New Testament being lifted up as an example, it's the writer to the Hebrews that does that. So Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Joseph, Moses are all lifted up in the book of Hebrews because Jews who had become Christians would have been familiar with these guys. I mean, this is history. And all you're doing is that you're trying to equate Jewish history to Christianity. Christianity is not a new religion. The Messiah has come, folks. And all I'm doing is connecting the dots. And that Messiah was Jesus. And this is the readings for this week. We'll spend time with Revelation next week. Any quick questions?
This is not a question, but Mark Twain went to Genoa when he was traveling. He went to a museum. This is about Titus's head. He went to a museum and they had two skulls of Christopher Columbus. One when he was a boy, one when he was a man.
Yeah, the artifacts, the heads of saints and stuff, yeah, to have the boy head and the adult head, yes, that would be helpful. It's interesting because when you do travel through the Middle East, and the first time I went to Israel, and of course you get exposed to all of this ancient stuff. What was interesting is not so much that actually this is where Lazarus' tomb was at, but actually this is Bethany. It happened in here someplace. You know, we're in the footsteps of where these folks walked. It's when you get down to specifically, these are the relics of the saints. Because in Venice, St. Mark's Cathedral, one of the things that they venerate is the hand of St. Mark. I mean, they've got it, it looks like a shriveled up, it's really ugly. But it's in the altar, and it's in Europe, you see the saints all wrapped up in gold foil, laying under, in the altars. Who knows? When I die, I would hope that that's not, they're going to drag my body around. Let's close with a word of prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity to come together again today as we continue our journey through the New Testament and as we wind it up next week. We ask you to watch over those who are traveling, especially those who are coming back from Europe this week from Zion. We ask for safe travel in their lives as well. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Thank you.